This week on Just Solutions, as the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, how is the media covering the war? The hypocrisy of coverage of this conflict compared to other wars is being laid bare. In contrast to the extensive coverage of civilian casualties in Ukraine, there has been scant coverage of civilian deaths when it was the US military launching the invasions. Our guest today is author and media critic Jeff Cohen, the director of the Park Centre for Independent Media at Ithaca College and founder of the media watch group FAIR. His recent article in Common Dreams examines how major American media outlets oppose military aggression, unless, that is, the United States is doing it. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Jeff, it's so great to have you back with us on Just Solutions. Thanks for being our guest today.
Nice to see you.
Well, I think what really gets at the heart of what you're writing about, this hypocrisy that we're seeing playing out in certainly corporate-controlled media, gets to the fact that we are often presented this binary paradigm, this narrative that the US is always a good actor in these conflicts or a benevolent force on the global stage, and then you have the others. And so in that framework and in the context of what you were trying to get to in your Common Dreams article, what are you seeing as the main areas of hypocrisy in terms of the coverage of the invasion by Russian troops of Ukraine and compare that to other wars?
There's almost too many examples of hypocrisy to name. There's a couple consistencies. I'd say the main one is warmongers dominate US television and US media, whether it's the US invading or Russia invading. I saw a journalist over the weekend just badgering Secretary of State Tony Blinken about why no-fly zone over Ukraine. And Blinken, who's been a warmonger his whole life, who, when he wasn't in government service, pocketed millions of dollars from US military corporations, he had to explain sort of patiently that, well, a no-fly zone can lead to nuclear war, So that's one consistency, that there's no debate in mainstream media allowed whether the US is invading Panama or Iraq or Russia's invading Ukraine. There's no debate. But the hypocrisies are that there's all of these issues, as you said, Maeve, that the main ideology of US mainstream media, and remember, I worked in cable news for years, the main ideology is American exceptionalism, that no matter what the facts are on the ground, the US is a force for peace, a force for human rights, a force for democracy. That's a given, that the US is a benevolent actor overseas. And given that framework, when the US has been the military aggressor, when the US has been killing thousands and thousands of civilians, when the US has been violating international law, when the US is engaging in what they now talk about Russian imperialism, but when the US is practicing imperialism, none of these issues are covered. Indeed, as you know, I was at MSNBC in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, and I was terminated along with Phil Donahue. If you try to cover that this war might be destabilizing, that this war is going to kill innocent civilians, you'll be taken off of the air, as Phil Donahue and I were taken off the air. So you can go through any one of these issues, whether it's the civilian toll, whether it's international law, which is never talked about when the US violates international law by invading Panama, by invading Iraq. But today, this morning, as we tape, I heard on both CNN and MSNBC about how the Russians have violated international law. Of course they have. This is an aggressive military action. Of course they're killing civilians. It's atrocious what Russia's doing. But when the US was doing it, and doing it even more emphatically, these same journalists, I can remember, and FAIR has written about this for years at fair.org, when the bomber planes are taking off of aircrafts, you'll see US correspondents and anchors almost having orgasms on the air, how beautiful it is. When the bombs were going off above Baghdad, they were celebrating the picturesque imagery coming off of Baghdad. So when the US is the military aggressor, it's almost celebrated. But when the Russians are the military aggressor, for the first time in decades, civilians are being put in the foreground of US media war coverage. That's a great thing, because in modern warfare, civilians are the main victims. And I'm seeing, every hour I turn on the television, Maeve, cable news where I used to work. And within 3 minutes, I'm picking up the pen to write down phrases that I never heard when the US was bombing Iraq. Like in the first few days of the war, one of the networks, it was CNN, was talking about the expanding savagery of the Russian attack on the capital city of Kyiv, because 20 homes had been destroyed. Well, think about it. When the US correspondents and anchors were celebrating shock and awe, which was the US bombing of Iraq in March of 2003, and the capital city, Baghdad. And the evidence, we knew quickly that about 300 civilians were being killed every day beneath the bombardment. Within a few weeks, it was 7,000 civilians. It wasn't just 20 homes in the capital city of Baghdad, Iraq. It was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of homes. So I've got to say, in summing up, I'm heartened that for the first time in decades, the civilian toll of a war is being foregrounded by US media. That's wonderful. They're the main victims. That's what journalism should do. But when the US was the culprit and was killing all of these civilians, you just couldn't get it covered. And, I wrote in my column, Maeve, that when the US invaded Afghanistan, and quickly they'd scattered, Al-Qaeda had fled to Pakistan and other countries, but the US occupied it for 20 years, US occupation of Afghanistan. And in the first days of that invasion, 2 memos leaked out that CNN management gave to all of the anchors and correspondents, that if they ever hinted at US military deaths, civilian deaths caused by the US military in Afghanistan, the anchors had to say, this military action is in response to a terrorist attack in the United States that killed thousands. They had to say that every time. One memo said, it may start sounding rote, but you have to do this every time. And that was the kind of rationalization, excusing of killing of innocent civilians in Afghanistan by the US right after our civilians had just been killed innocently in New York. But one set of civilians is off the record.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about that and the coverage of certain civilians in this war, essentially in this assault on Ukraine, because of course there are many, many reports coming out of how badly people of color who are refugees are being treated in this. And I will touch on that, Jeff, but just what you have just said there reminds me so much of, I've been thinking a lot when the reports are coming out that Russia has imposed these laws. You can be imprisoned up to, I think, 15 years for essentially publishing anything that questions the dominant narrative, that even describing this as a war. Now, the US didn't imprison journalists as such, but people were certainly losing their jobs in the coverage of previous conflicts. And you yourself have direct experience of this. When you question the dominant narrative, and also you use language that has not been approved. So instead of saying collateral damage, you would say victims of war.
No doubt. Again, during wartime, people did lose their jobs here, and it wasn't a lot. But when someone loses their job at MSNBC, as we did, everyone in the building knows what happened. And everyone in the building then engages in self-censorship. Prior to the invasion of Iraq, on the Phil Donahue show, which was the most watched program on MSNBC when we were terminated 3 weeks before the invasion of Iraq, we were putting people on the air who were saying, look, this is going to be a violation of international law. This is going to be devastating to civilians. For saying those things, we lost our jobs. Today, I'm happy to say that the US media is covering the violation of international law committed by the Russians. I'm happy to see its empathetic coverage of all these civilians that are being terrorized because of missiles and bombs dropping in their neighborhoods. Well, this happened in spades, far more severely when the US was bombing Iraq. And now I'm seeing all this sensitive coverage. And again, I'm not criticizing today's coverage. I'm criticizing what happens when the US invades a country. And believe me, the US will invade another country in the coming years. It's what we've done for decade after decade. But when I hear about the pregnant women giving birth in shelters, in terror, do you think during the weeks and months of shock and awe, one of the most violent bombing campaigns in global history that the US committed over Baghdad and other places in Iraq, do you think that magically women in Iraq quit giving birth? So there's this magical thinking when the US is dropping the bombs. And I would say, I mentioned that the CNN directives telling people, all of their anchors and staff members and correspondents, when the US had invaded Afghanistan, that basically civilian deaths were off limits. It continued, Maeve, for 20 years. You know, I was watching all of these summing up reports on TV news, and Lester Holt, who I worked with at MSNBC, and he was basically a patsy for all the lies that led to the invasion of Iraq when I worked with him at MSNBC. Now he's the anchor of NBC Nightly News, and Lester's not one of the worst journalists. He's probably better than most, but he did his summing up of Afghanistan last April, and he called it America's longest war. And in his summing up report, he gives one and only one figure on the death toll. He says that the war caused 2,300 American deaths. So here you have one and only one death toll is the US soldiers, not the civilians. He did not mention that at the conservative estimate, more than 70,000 Afghan civilians had died since the invasion of 2001. He didn't mention a pretty recent United Nations report that showed that in the first 6 months of 2019, more Afghan civilians were killed by the US and its allies than were killed by the horrific Taliban and its allies. So again, the issue of civilian deaths, which should be foregrounded in every war coverage, is never done that when the US is the culprit. And that's why my head is spinning as I see some of these correspondents and anchors that I worked with 20 years ago. All of a sudden, they found it newsworthy that modern warfare is killing all these civilians and causing terror, even if you're not killed. Imagine when you've got kids in your home and bombs are dropping all over the place. We never heard that when the victims were Muslims, when the victims were Iraqis, when the victims were Afghans, when the victims were poor people in the tenements of Panama City and the US invaded Panama. That was off limits, and every journalist in the US understood that's off limits to talk about civilian deaths and civilian trauma.
Well, we would love to hear from our viewers. Let us know your thoughts on this issue. Let us know how you remember previous conflicts being covered and how that is in sharp contrast to what we're seeing right now with the coverage of what's happening in Ukraine. Drop us a comment in the comment box and connect with us on social media as well and let us know your thoughts. Well, Jeff, in terms of the appropriate front and center coverage of the civilians who are always the victims in conflict, and that we're seeing very extensive coverage as part of this conflict. We're also seeing these racist undertones coming out, which have been called out really extensively, but it is definitely worth exploring. Not just politicians from some of the neighboring states, neighboring Ukraine, but actual anchors and reporters saying, this is horrifying what's happening to these people. They look just like us. They've blonde hair, blue eyes. They have Netflix subscriptions, as if that's some type of metric for our humanity. But, talk a little bit about that, about why potentially we are seeing such extensive coverage of what's happening in Ukraine from the perspective of the civilian casualties.
Yeah, I think the main factor is that the U.S. is not doing the bombardment, but you're right. The other factor is that these are white Europeans, by and large, that are being victimized. And they aren't Muslims, they aren't Arabs, they aren't Iraqis, they aren't Panamanians, they aren't Salvadorans or Nicaraguans, because when they were the victims of U.S. aggression, it's often easier to ignore them. But you're right, the racist undertones have been, sometimes they're overtones. You mentioned the references to blue eyes and the references to how much they're like us. One CBS correspondent said they're more civilized. They're more European. We don't, war doesn't usually happen here. Well, in fact, Europe is one of the bloodiest places historically for wars. But in this guy, he had to distinguish between sort of worthy victims and unworthy victims. I mean, what kills me is, while there's a very big difference, as you pointed out, in how civilians are being covered in this war versus US wars, and when the victims are white Europeans as opposed to the victims of US wars in many places, I think of all of the war hawks that are dominating coverage. I think of the New York Times foreign affairs columnist, Thomas Friedman. And you made me remember this, Maeve, when you brought up Netflix. They subscribe to Netflix like we subscribe to Netflix. Well, in the mid 1990s, Thomas Friedman concocted this theory. It was called the Golden Arches theory of peace, which is there would never be a war, there would never be military conflict between two nations that have McDonald's restaurants. And it turns out that Russia, at least prior to McDonald's claiming they're pulling out, had 800 McDonald's restaurants. And Ukraine had 80 McDonald's restaurants. But Thomas Friedman saying this kind of idiocy, that a McDonald's country will not declare war, there won't be conflict between two countries that have McDonald's franchises, it's utter idiocy that gets passed off as brilliance about foreign affairs. Noam Chomsky, who truly is brilliant about foreign affairs, he can be interviewed by mainstream news outlets all over the world, but he's boycotted, he's blacklisted in his own country. I know this from when I worked in cable news. So I want to bring up one more Thomas Friedman anecdote, and it's brought up by your Netflix comment. In 1999, when there was a huge movement around the world against corporate US-led globalization, and Friedman is sort of like an idiot savant. Most of what he said is drivel, it's silly, but every so often he blurts out the truth. So he writes a column in 1999 that the magical hand, the hidden hand of the marketplace, needs to be backed up by the hidden fist. That for McDonald's franchises to flourish around the world, we need McDonnell Douglas. the builder of the F-15 fighter jet. That's virtually a word for word quote. And so here you have Thomas Friedman blurting out basically that, for US corporate capitalism to flourish across the globe, you need for it to be backed up by US militarism. That's normally an issue that's off limits. Andrew Coburn, the great independent journalist, is not getting on television a lot. I have not seen him on mainstream TV, but he's got this incredible new book called The Spoils of War: Power, Profit, and the American War Machine. And he talks about that the driver of policy are the war manufacturers. Part of the reason that NATO kept expanding eastward toward Russia's borders is because the war makers in the United States were making so much money. And that's another issue, Maeve, that's off limits, is the war profiteering, the profiteering from militarism. And, I keep hearing Lawrence O'Donnell once went on and on about Russian imperialism. And a hallmark of imperialism is when a powerful country uses its might against a neighboring country or a foreign country to inflict power and threat to get that government of the poorer or the less powerful neighboring country to change its regime, which is what Russia is doing in Ukraine. Well, the United States has done that. No country has done it so many times in the last 70 years than the United States. We have gone into countries, changed their regime, often good governments, to fascistic or military governments, whether you're talking about Iran in 1953, Guatemala in 1954, Congo when Patrice Lumumba was assassinated in 1960, Chile when the democratic government was overthrown in 73. You could keep going to other countries. 2009. This is the most important one in my view. Never was covered in mainstream media, not covered today, when it should be front and center because of what Russia is doing in trying to impose regime change on the democratically elected government in Ukraine. Honduras in 2009 had a democratically elected president, Zelaya. He was trying to help the poor. He was a progressive-oriented national leader, and the military had a coup. And every single government in our hemisphere immediately denounced the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Honduras. There was one government, the hegemon, the one government that mattered under President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, that said, we're not sure, we're investigating. It's because of the power of the United States that Honduras had a military regime that set about assassinating indigenous leaders, environmental leaders, feminist leaders. And it was because of the US power over the regime, keeping the coup regime in power in Honduras, when all of the lesser countries, the not as strong countries in the Western Hemisphere, denounced that coup. So that's one more contradiction. I'm hearing that Russia has imperialism. You're not allowed to say the United States has imperialism. A hallmark of imperialism is you use your power to overthrow governments and do regime change. Another hallmark of imperialism is military bases all over the world. Russia has 20 foreign bases in a half dozen countries. The United States, we have about 800 foreign military bases in about 80 foreign countries. Another hallmark of imperialism is your military might. Our military budget is more than 12 times that of Russia. Another hallmark of imperialism is your weapon sales all over the world. 80% of military weapons exports come out of the United States. And my final point on this, Freedom House is this conservative think tank that's US government funded. Every year they rank the most oppressive anti-democratic governments in the world. Well, of the 50 most oppressive governments, according to Freedom House, the United States offers military training or military arms to 40 of the 50 most oppressive governments. That's what I would call US imperialism, but you're not allowed to use that phrase unless you put in scare quotes in the New York Times.
Well, we just have a few minutes left, Jeff, and there's so much to dig into. And I know that FAIR, the organization Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting that you founded, has done extensive coverage of all of this. There's, of course, your Common Dreams article and all of the independent outlets that do highlight voices like Noam Chomsky, because I have been educated on the history of NATO and its expansion eastward over the years, not just in the context of Ukraine, but going back years and years, because Noam Chomsky appearing on shows like Democracy Now! And so as we finish up, Jeff, the role of independent media when we are seeing the continued domination of militaristic interests, put it that way, in our corporate media. Talk a little bit as we finish up about why we need to have these independent media spaces preserved so we can have voices like Noam Chomsky and all of those other folks who are questioning the dominant narrative.
Right. I mean, there's been a boom in independent media in our country in the last 20 years. Free speech TV is part of it. When you showcase Sonali, when you showcase Democracy Now!, Tom Hartman, he doesn't talk about foreign policy much, but, you know, independent media has never been more crucial. And independent media are booming. I've been watching free speech TV because I've been in motel rooms in Florida. And I mean, free speech TV is a vital independent. If you are an activist who cares about human rights and you care about democracy, real democracy, and you care about peace, the best thing you can do is support independent media. It's to donate to free speech TV. Free speech TV does not have a marketing budget. NBC News, ABC News, they spend millions of dollars, CNN, to market themselves, Time Magazine. So if you, without a marketing budget, the only way free speech TV gets around is if people use their social media, use their telephones to tell people, hey, you've got to watch what's on free speech TV today. And the other way to challenge militarized corporate media is to support independent groups like FAIR, fair.org, get on their email list. I mean, FAIR exposed NBC News recently during this invasion. They said it's another mark of the increased savagery of Russia that they're using cluster bombs. And the reporter said the U.S. has not used cluster bombs since the Gulf War of 1991. Well, as FAIR pointed out, and they have not been able, even though hundreds of FAIR activists have contacted NBC News, they still haven't retracted it, but they were off by 18 years. The US used cluster bombs in Bosnia, in Serbia, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Yemen in 2009. And Human Rights Watch was complaining even a few years ago that US manufactured and provided cluster bombs were being used by the awful regime Saudi Arabia in their war against Yemen. So they were only off by 5 wars in 18 years. And FAIR can point out this kind of mistake, this kind of pro-war, pro-American exceptionalism bias. And so I believe if you're a media activist, and it's better to be media active than radio active, you support independent media like Free Speech TV, Sonali, Democracy Now!, and you join media activism groups like FAIR, fair.org.
Jeff Cohen, it's always so great to have you join us on Just Solutions. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
And thank you for what you do.
And don't forget, Just Solutions is also available as a podcast, so you can subscribe to it wherever you get your podcasts and never miss an episode. And join us again next week, same time, same place, for another conversation from Free Speech TV, Just Solutions.